Fusion Mobile, quality e-learning experience on the go.
We will now go into the factors that led to the rise and growth of nationalism in Nigeria. As we discuss on this, we will look into the external factors and the internal factors. Firstly, as we look into the external factors, we have the Atlantic Charter. This charter emphasized the right to self-determination by all the people of the world. Both Britain and USA signed this charter, which was published after the Second World War. The charter was in conflict with the British colonial policies in West Africa, but the American government favored decolonization. This encouraged nationalists to demand for independence. Number 2, British Labour Party. The influence of the Labour Party in Britain in opposing the Conservative Party's policy on colonization influenced the growth of nationalism in Nigeria. Number 3, colonial posture of the United Nations organization. The UN adopted a negative posture towards colonialism and imperialism. It gave its support to nations fighting for their independence. In addition, the UN General Assembly was used as a platform by most heads of states and government to criticize colonial and imperial powers. Number 4, the independence of some countries. India in 1947 and Ghana in 1957 attained their independence, and this spurred on Nigerian nationalists into increased nationalism. Number 5, the superpowers. The emergence of USA and USSR as superpowers after the Second World War gave impetus to nationalist activities in Nigeria and West Africa as a whole. Both countries detested colonialism and imperialism. Number 6, activities of Pan-African leaders. The impact and activities of prominent individuals and organizations such as some black American leaders and other blacks in diaspora like W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, as well as other groups like West African Student Union, Negro World Movement. These all gave inspiration to Nigerian nationalists to fight for independence. Number 7, Britain's humiliating defeat by Japan. The defeat of Britain by Japan reduced her influence and prestige worldwide. These and many others constitute the external factors that led to the rise and growth of nationalism in Nigeria. We now come to the internal factors. Number 1, the discriminatory attitude of the Europeans to Nigerians is the first factor as we consider the internal factors that gave rise to nationalism in Nigeria. There was racial discrimination in employment, leading to limited opportunities for Nigerians in the civil service. Number 2, the influence of Christianity and schools establishment made the nationalists to realize that after all, men are created equal by God. Number 3, return of the ex-servicemen. Some Africans fought alongside Britain and the Allied forces during the Second World War against Germany and Axis power. The job promised them after the war was not given to them on their return to West Africa. So the return of the ex-servicemen also led to the rise of nationalism in Nigeria. Number 4, activities of learned elites like Nnamdi Azikiwe, H.O. Davis, Herbert Macaulay, Bafemi Awolowo, Kwame Nkrumah, etc. mobilized the masses for support during the struggle for independence. Number 5. Introduction of elective principle in 1922. The elective principle, which was introduced in 1922, favored only Lagos and Calabar. The majority of Nigerians were disenfranchised, and this provoked the growth of nationalism in Nigeria. Number 6. Some of the trade unions, e.g. Railway Workers Union led by Michael Imodu and others, became militant and used strike actions to back their demand for better working conditions. They equally supported nationalist leaders in the struggle against colonial rule. Number 7. The formation of political parties like the Nigerian Youth Movement, NYM in brackets, the NNDP, the NCNC, the AG were formed, and they played leading role in the growth of nationalism in Nigeria. These and more constitutes the internal factors that led to the rise and growth of nationalism in Nigeria. We now go into nationalist movements in British West Africa. Number 1, we have the West African Students Union, in bracket WASU. This movement was formed in 1925 by Chief Ladipo Solanke of Nigeria. The interests of this union centered on commerce, education, politics, etc. In her achievements, this union served as a forum for protest movements among West African and other sympathizers in Britain. It published a journal known as WASU, and other pamphlets which it published had effects on West Africans abroad and at home. Its teachings on racial equality and self-determination for the people were pronounced in this students' movement, and the teaching was also carried home by ex-members. It also served as a training ground for political leadership for West African intellects. It also became a link between West African leaders at home and the parliament in Britain, who supported the African cause for political development and change. The second movement that we have is the National Congress of British West Africa. This movement was formed in 1920 by Joseph Ephraim Castley Hereford of Gold Coast, Ghana, and Dr. Akinwade Savage of Nigeria. In most of his writings, Castley Hereford criticized the shortcomings of British indirect rule. Political issues linked with the First World War helped greatly in rekindling people's interests in the Congress. Example, these West African leaders wanted to be involved in formulating policies as they affected post-war Togo and Cameroon. They also wanted more African participation in administration, judiciary, and other sensitive areas of government. They equally opposed discrimination and advocated for the use of elections into assemblies of representation. The National Congress of West Africa had the following to be its aims and objectives. Number 1, it wanted an effective representation in governments at all levels based on free election. Number 2, it demanded for reforms on administration, and also equal opportunities irrespective of color. Number 3, it wanted trained and qualified lawyers to be judges, and that the flogging of women for any offense be stopped. Number 4, the Congress demanded for the right to self-determination of West Africans. Number 5, it condemned the attitude of economic oppression and trade restrictions, including the inflow of Asians into West Africa. These and others constitute the aims and objectives of the National Congress of British West Africa. We come to the next one, which is the Nigerian Youth Movement, NYM. The Nigerian Youth Movement was founded in 1935. It was originally known as Lagos Youth Movement, formed in 1934 by some Nigerians like Ernest Ikoli, Dr. J.C. Vaughan, and Samuel Akinsanya. It was led by Ikoli Ernest. Later, H.O. Davies and Dr. Azikiwe Nnamdi joined the movement. Other members were Bafemi Awolowo, Samuel Akintola, etc. With this wide membership, its composition assumed a national outlook. This movement was able to compete with NNDP for the control of political activities in Lagos. In its achievements, it won all the 3 elected seats allocated to Lagos in the Legislative Council. It defeated NNDP, which was formed in 1923. Number 2, it worked hard to promote national unity. It was the first political party with a national outlook based on the diverse and wide makeup of its membership. The party also spearheaded the quest for a political independence of Nigeria. The party also had some branches all over the country, which were opened in some towns in the southern parts of the country. Having looked into these movements, we now go into the concept of pan-africanism. The advocates of pan-africanism propounded the need for racial harmony, mutual existence coupled with absolute equality and respect for the dignity of Africans. It further accepts the need for cooperation and unity among African states in the areas of economic, political, and cultural spheres. It detests and rejects in totality all forms of colonial rule, control, and domination of any African states. It stands for the rights of Africans to self-determination and the need to be treated with dignity and respect. It tends to instill in Africans a sense of belief and self-confidence in themselves as a people or a race. The movement was developed outside Africa, with the popular slogan of its proponents being Africa for the Africans and African personality in parentheses. It was formed by Africans in diaspora. They were constantly faced with discrimination, and so they saw Africa as their real home. Some of its leading members were Edward Blyden, a Liberian, Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, an Afro-American, and George Padmore, a West Indian. Different Pan-African conferences took place in Paris, 1918, in Lisbon in 1923, New York in 1927, and Manchester in 1945. Most of the issues talked on at these conferences were mainly on the unity of all Negro people, and the 1945 Manchester Conference talked mostly on strategy and realistic approach towards the independence of African continent. The achievements of pan-Africanism. The movement worked and spoke against colonial rule, which led to the liberation of Africa. Number 2, it helped African nationalists in articulating their demands and supported them in their struggle for independence. Number 3, it gave rise to the tempo of national consciousness, especially after the Second World War. We will now go to the effects of the Second World War on nationalism in Nigeria/West Africa. Number 1, we have the Atlantic Charter. Article 3 of the Atlantic Charter states that the Allied forces should respect the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. It was a welcome development to the West African nationalists, having the hope that independence or self-government would be achieved at the end of the war. Number 2, USA and USSR emerged as the two superpowers at the end of the war. Both countries detested colonialism and imperialism and supported the demands of those oppressed for justice and fair play, equity and self-rule. Number 3, the British Labour Party opposed vehemently the policies of the Conservative Party in government towards imperialism. The Labour Party favored the right of self-determination of all people. Number 4, the West African Students' Union, which was formed in 1925, agitated for political reforms, and this was done through public lectures and lobbying of the British Parliament for a sympathetic hearing. They also enlightened most of their members on their political rights, leadership training, and many of them later became leading statesmen in their various countries. Number 5, there was greater economic dependence on Africans by the Allied powers. They needed African raw materials for their industries. This new economic posture brought about a rapid development in export and import trade of Nigeria and West Africa. The people became rich and a well-to-do population grew. Urban centers multiplied and many went to school. This development helped in preparing the minds of the people towards the need to resist colonial rule and support the nationalist struggle. These and many others are the effects of the Second World War on nationalism in Nigeria/West Africa. We now go to the contribution of nationalists to the achievements of Nigerian independence. In which way did the nationalists in Nigeria contribute to the achievement of our independence? Number 1, by forming political parties like the NNDP, NCNC, NPC, AG, they helped in achieving independence for Nigeria. Number 2, through the print media, mostly the use of newspapers. They used these papers to agitate for social, political, and other reforms. Number 3, they organized labor unions and meetings, which became a force to reckon with because they supported the struggle for self-rule in Nigeria. An example is the Railway Workers Union. Number 4, they equally organized strikes and boycotts to back up their demands. Number 5, they wrote petitions to the Secretary of State for Colonies in London on issues of pressing concern. Example, reforms, self-government, and constitutional revisions. Number 6, they also sent a delegation to London and to the government which is meant to pressure London to accede to their numerous demands. Number 7. They organized rallies, symposia, and lectures, which was aimed at educating the people on their political rights. These are some of the contributions of nationalists to the achievement of Nigerian independence. Having seen this, we will now go to the effects of nationalism in Nigeria. What are the effects of nationalism in Nigeria? Number 1, nationalism in Nigeria encouraged political education and training of future political leaders, as people were educated on their political rights. Number 2, it led to the formation of political parties. Example, we have the NNDP, the NCNC, MPC, the AG, which played key roles in the strive to attain nationalism. Number 3, newspapers played an effective role in awakening the minds of Nigerians towards the struggle for self-rule. Example is the West African Pilot and Lagos Daily News. Number 4, nationalism resulted in the reforms of most of the colonial constitutions. These changes were necessary in order to involve Nigerians in the affairs of their country. Number 5, nationalism led to the independence of Nigeria on the 1st of October 1960. Number 6, nationalism resulted in Nigeria's taking part in some of the constitutional conferences, both within and outside the country. In the process, reforms were brought into the political system. Number 7, nationalism gave inspiration to some trade unions, making them to become militant. They pressed and demanded for their rights and their improved working conditions. They later found themselves in working alliance with nationalist movements in the country. These are the effects of nationalism on Nigeria. We now look into the reasons why nationalist activities were slow in French West African colonies. Number 1, the policy of assimilation, which stipulated the integration of learned African into French system, was a great privilege. They enjoyed equal rights as there was no discrimination in the civil service. Consequently, as civil servants, they could not revolt or agitate for anything, since the system benefited them. Number 2, the policy of assimilation, instead of contributing to the people's well-being, endangered it socially, economically, and politically. Number 3, there was the absence of fundamental human rights in most areas governed. The government did not recognize the right of the people. Number 4, no freedom of the press. This made it difficult for people to criticize government activities. The press, which was supposed to be the people's mouthpiece, was censored. Number 5, people's vision for freedom and independent states was strangulated, and not until after the Second World War, when other factors started adding impetus to the growth of nationalism, was agitation became more pronounced. Number 7, take 2. Number 6, the election of Africans into the French chamber as deputies also reduced the urge for nationalist activities. Number 7, the absence of political parties and organizations made it difficult for the people to express their political views on government activities. These are some of the reasons why nationalist activities were slow in French West African colonies.